welcome to BCM325 Future Cultures. In this two-part video series, we're going to explore the purpose of futures studies in detail. We aren't really going to cover its methodologies or ways of doing research. Rather, we are going to first examine the process of looking at and thinking about the future. We're also going to look at some of the founders of futures studies as part of a longer conversation that we're going to have about futurists in later videos. Futures studies has a number of names, and several of them have been placed under examination by Ziauddin Sardar, a scholar and public intellectual who brings a framework for understanding the future that pushes our thinking beyond the typical boundaries of westernized thinking. Sardar specializes in Muslim thought, and he was the editor of the Futures Journal from 1999 to 2012. He is the author and editor of a number of important books on futures studies, and in this video I want to take a look at one of Sardar's most cited articles on futures studies, his piece titled The Namesake: Futures, Futures Studies, Futurology, Futuristic, Foresight. What's in a name? Sardar begins with the analysis of the word future, derived from the Latin futura, or futurus, which means going to be. One of the problems of the term future is that it suggests that we are only concerned with looking ahead to a singular point. It creates the notion that there is only one possible future. The reason why I sign off these videos with the phrase "the future is now" is to return our gaze from the horizon to where we are currently, to focus on the time and space that we are occupying, and to understand it is the now which brings the many possible futures into being. Sardar is highly critical of the concept of the future and the way that it is often employed by futurists and futures studies. He argues that the future has been colonized and that futures studies has become an instrument in that colonization. Anticipating the future nowadays means little more than forecasting the future, and the future is little more than the transformation of society by new Western technologies. Sardar, 2010. The future is thus locked into a single, dominant but myopic projection. Sardar is not alone in his critique of futures studies and the westernized focus on a singular horizon. Eleonora Massini writes, "There is not just one future, there are many futures." She argues that the process of visioning should be central to the study of possible futures. But we have to recognize that the visions of a desirable future are embedded in the social structures from which they emerge. Massini suggests that the seeds of real change are almost always to be found on the periphery, in the non-Western cultures, among women and children, and the outsiders, such as poets, artists, and philosophers. Futures thinking, argues Massini, must be linked to social responsibility and to ethical values that are clearly expressed and defined, and it should be a continuous learning process. This is a complicated issue, and not only about criticizing Western civilization as the dominant mode of being and thinking, but also about being open, inclusive, diverse, and creative in the ways that we imagine and represent the future. We, in present time, argues Massini, need to look at the future in ways that go beyond the creation of beautifully conceived but ultimately elusive utopias. Our future must not only be foreseen and dreamt of, but chosen and built. There is also danger to the inverse of the argument that the West ignores perspectives that it considers foreign, which can be found in the fetishization of the foreign as being somehow magical or special. This can be observed in the way that the West has represented the Asianness of the future in movies like Blade Runner. David Morley and Kevin Robbins use the term techno-orientalism to refer to the way that Japan is represented in science fiction, particularly in the cyberpunk genre with regards to new technologies such as robotics and cyborg enhancements, which presents Japan as a technological utopia that is ultimately another form of discrimination known as othering. Othering is reductive. It reduces the differences between people and cultures to a category or stereotype, in which one way of being is considered to be greater or lesser than another, despite the anthropological sameness between people. Othering can be a particularly pernicious form of colonialism, in which the colonizers dominate by reducing the native civilization to an inferior status through false binary relations to social class, race, gender, sexuality, religion, culture, and so on. Another name for futures studies is futurology, a term proposed by the German professor Ossip K. Flechtheim in the 1940s to describe a new type of science that would bring together the science of mathematics and probability with the physical and social sciences and creative and critical thinking to predict and plan for the future. Jenny Anderson writes, "To Flechtheim, the future was not a science of prediction, but a new and more systematic utopian reflection on the present. Moreover, futurology was a veritable battleground for different future visions." Flechtheim thought it was the job of universities to teach about the future, and imagined a new democratic alternative for the future that would take humanity beyond simplistic notions such as capitalism and communism and other political economic systems that had dominated the 20th century. Ziauddin Sadar also identifies a couple of problems with the term futurology. First is the implication of crystal gazing and fortune telling, like astrology, that it was not grounded in the empirical sciences. Second is the inverse problem that the term ology has imperialistic connotations, and Sadar sees a deliberate association with biology, entomology, paleontology, and other ologies of science, suggesting scientific neutrality and certitude. He argues that the pretension that exploration of the future is or can be an exact field of inquiry is both naive and dangerous. There are also problems with the term futurism, argues Wendell Bell, whose work on futures studies we have examined in previous videos and will return to in part 2 of this video. The term futurism, argues Bell, should be avoided at all cost because it is a label associated with the far-right radical art movement that flourished in Italy during the early 20th century. Ziauddin Sadar also highlights a couple of interesting points to note about the fascist Italian futurists, as they called themselves. Filippo Tommaso Marinetti was the patriarch of Italian futurism, and his followers replaced religious belief with the absolute certainty in the benefits of scientific progress. They believed that science would discover a way of knowing the future. Their vision of the future was totally technocratic and based on speed, technology, and a fusion of man and machine. The Futurism movement wanted to destroy the past in every way. They wanted to get rid of, quote, the smell of gangrenous professors, archaeologists, tourist guides, and antiquarians, and to destroy old cities and museums and set fire to the library shelves, as Marinetti declared in his Manifesto of Futurism. Not only was the future monolithic under Futurism, it could only be realized by delinking the future from all human history. For the Italian futurists, the future was not simply a domain of time, but an ideology. Hence, it was an ism like capitalism, socialism, communism, with a specific social and political worldview. The futurists of futures studies are very different to the futurists under Marinetti's model of futurism. Prediction is a major component of futures studies. In fact, as Wendell Bell argues, prediction is part of being human. Children learn to anticipate the future as soon as they realize that crying results in reactions from others. As children learn a language, they begin by talking about the present, about objects and events in the here and now, and slowly begin to anticipate things not yet experienced, confusing words like yesterday and tomorrow. A prediction is also a statement about the expected occurrence of some future event or outcome. And there are many subtypes of prediction, including forecasts, projections, prophecy, prognostication, anticipation, and expectation. Predictions are a necessary part of decision-making and planning, which becomes routine to the human experience of social behavior. Most people are moderately good at basic prediction, or existing would be difficult, as we predict the consequences of our actions all the time. But that kind of prediction is usually about a time in the future that is very close to us. Distant prediction is something else entirely. If distant future prediction was possible, it would be the end of humanity as we know it. This is one of the messages of Frank Herbert's DUNE series, which is actually being remade by Denis Villeneuve for release in 2020. The protagonist in DUNE, Paul Atreides, and in later books, his son Leto, both gain the power of prescience, in which they can literally see the future, and each of these characters immediately becomes slaves to that future. By being able to predict the future, they become unable to alter it. This is also one of the paradoxes of time travel, that by traveling to the future and observing it, we lock it into place. In the book God Emperor of DUNE, Leto Atreides attempts to breed a type of human that is immune from the power of prescience and is no longer able to predict the future, thus freeing humanity from enslavement by the future. By not knowing the future, we are not tied to it, and events can occur that are not preordained. Professor Jim Dator somewhat jokingly proposed Dator's laws of future studies. 1. The future cannot be predicted because the future does not exist. 2. Any useful idea about the future should appear to be ridiculous. 3. We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. Predictions, forecasts, future scenarios, etc. do not provide us with knowledge of the future, but they do suggest certain limited possibilities. Some predictions, for example, have a high degree of certainty. Celestial mechanics can predict the movement of planetary bodies with very reliable mathematical systems. But nothing in society beyond the most trivial can be precisely predicted, argues Jim Dator. The future cannot be predicted, but alternative futures can be forecasted, and preferred futures can be envisioned and invented continuously. We can have knowledge of forecasts and visions, scenarios and expert opinions, concepts and methodologies of future studies. But this is, of course, not the same thing as knowing the future, argues Dator. Moreover, argues Ziauddin Sadar, even if this knowledge of the future was possible, we would not be able to recognize it, which is Dator's second law of futures. Any useful idea about the futures should appear to be ridiculous, and it would be dismissed as such. Some predictions are actually observations, like Moore's law. Gordon Moore was the co-founder of Intel the American technology company which invented the x86 series of microprocessors that are found in the majority of personal computers. Moore observed that the number of components on an integrated circuit doubled roughly every year in 1965, and revised that later to 2 years in 1975. He predicted that this rate of growth would continue for at least a decade, and was proven mostly correct until around 2012, when chip manufacturers began to run into the atomic physical limitations with the processes for shrinking microchip technology. Arthur C. Clarke was a British science fiction author and futurist who was famous for co-writing the 1968 film with Stanley Kubrick, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and proposed a communication satellite system using geostationary orbits in 1945. Clarke made a number of observations about the future of communication technologies like email and video phones, computers and the internet, search engines, mobile phones and smartwatches and other devices. These observations, or predictions, proved to be remarkably accurate, and there are links to other videos on Clarke in the subject Moodle site. Clarke was simultaneously applauded and ridiculed for his ideas about the future. He said that trying to predict the future is a discouraging and hazardous occupation. He thought that a prediction would inevitably become caught between two boundaries. On the one hand, a prediction that is considered reasonable in the present would be regarded as conservative in the future. On the other hand, a prediction that is considered absurd or far-fetched might actually have a chance of imagining a real possible future. This is similar to Dator's second law, and Clarke said that if what I say now seems to be very reasonable, then I have failed completely. Only if what I say appears absolutely unreasonable have we any chance of visualizing the future as it will really happen. Rather than an accurate prediction or prophecy, we can say that futurists like Clarke have an aptitude for foresight. Foresight, argues Sadar, implies action in the present responding to an anticipated future state of affairs. When managers ask for foresight, they are actually asking, how can I do this in the most prudent, that is, careful and cautious way to achieve the results that I want? What managers and bureaucrats want is a product. This is why foresight is most commonly associated with businesses and bureaucracies, and it has the added advantage of the illusion that the product comes wrapped with wisdom, with foresight. One of the early futurists was writer H.G. Wells, most well known for his science fiction books, The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and The War of the Worlds. In 1932, Wells wrote a treatise calling for professors of foresight that would help the world cope with the increased pace of technological change. H.G. Wells wanted the world to be better prepared for things to come, and was concerned with our lack of foresight. For example, he saw that we did nothing to our roads until they became choked and dangerous. In 1932, he thought it was ridiculous that time had to be spent to bring our police force up to date with the new concept of the motor bandit. He thought that the lack of foresight inevitably led to war and violence. Wells said in a famous broadcast that we will be brought together into a closely knit, freely communicating citizenship. But Sadar warns that Wells' vision was myopic. He thought that through foresight we could become a single world state with one money, one system, and one united vision of the future that did not allow for multiple possibilities. Foresight is intrinsically singular in nature, argues Sadar. The term suggests a monochromatic vision, a solitary way of foreseeing with a sole outcome. Indeed, argues Sadar, there is no plural in the English language for foresight. Foresights does not really exist. There we're going to leave part 1 of this video. In the next part, we are going to look at the work of Wendell Bell, futurist and professor of Futures Studies, and examine the 9 major purposes he proposes for the future of Futures Studies.